Good morning and welcome. One of the problems of having a really fun evening that goes late into the night is that then it's hard to get people out of bed the next morning. I'm really happy to be here this morning, and many thanks to Peter and Marika for inviting me, letting me be here. I'm sure you all know that this is the 6th iteration of the Cambridge Talks. I was sitting next to Barbara Elfman last night, and she said, "Do you know how the Cambridge Talks started?" And I said, "Not really." And she said, "Well, it started on the occasion of Michael's retirement." And I said, and, we were in the middle of dinner, and I was just sort of not quite sure, what did she mean, Michael's retirement? Michael is here. And of course, Barbara's life and world is completely focused on the ASP and the PhD and the doctoral programs. So when she speaks about retirement, she just means specifically related to the PhD program, not general. So that I was taken aback. As you know, Michael is very much here. One of the things that you try not to do too much in this line of work is to make mistakes, or too many mistakes. I think often we spend a lot of time trying to rectify what you perceive to be mistakes, but from time to time I think you also make what you consider to be some good decisions, and really during the past 4 years I can't think of a better decision than to ask Antoine and Michael to take on the labor and the care and really the love of the doctoral programs here at the school, and I think they've done an incredible job. So I don't know, Michael, what the students will do when, according to Barbara, you retire again from the PhD program at some point. But this is a fantastic thing to have this incredible Cambridge Talks, and also I think it's a special, it's really a special occasion for me to have known Marika and Peter for a while, and of course many other people in the PhD program, and to see the incredible work that they have done here at the school and the contributions that they have made to the school. Obviously, the theme of this event today is consistent with many of the other presentations that have happened, which is interdisciplinary, trying to deal with this question of over and under and on. It's a wonderful way to really capture very important issues that we are making. For me, it's actually personally very exciting because the manner of thinking of this conference is sectional in a way. And even though you're dealing with specific configurations of these areas of the atmosphere, the Earth, and the kind of the geological, I think the whole issue of the section is something that's really under-articulated, if you like, in the field of architecture. And I am hoping that in the fall we will in fact have a conference specifically on the section, which would also be a very good means for us to not only look at the section through architecture, but also through landscape and the city. So I think this is a fantastic conference that has brought a lot of very, very important, very interesting people together. And I'm really looking forward to the day's presentation, of course, being in and out a little bit, but would like to ask you to please welcome Peter and Marika, who will set the scene for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Mustafavi. Hi, and thank you for coming to the 6th Annual Cambridge Talks, hosted by the Harvard Graduate School of Design Advanced Studies Program. I am Marika Trotter. I'm a second-year PhD student.
And I'm Peter Christensen, a third-year PhD candidate.
And we are the organizers of this year's event, entitled Over, Under, On, Architecture and the Earth. We would like to thank our sponsors for their generous support, the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Harvard Graduate Student Council, the Weatherhead Center of International Affairs, and the GSD PhD Talks program. We would also like to thank the co-directors of the PhD program, K. Michael Hayes and Antoine Picon, for their advice and support, our volunteer colleagues from the Master of Design Studies program in the History and Philosophy of Design, Monica Belliman and Trudy Renwick, thank you. And most importantly, our Administrative Director of the Advanced Studies program, Barbara Elfman, whose generous planning expertise and sure guidance made this event possible, and indeed make it possible every year. Thank you. Cambridge Talks is an annual spring conference by the PhD program in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning at Harvard University, dedicated to the exploration of interdisciplinary topics that engage issues of space. Our theme this year, as you might have guessed, is architecture and the Earth, specifically how architecture relates to 3 planetary strata: the Earth's atmosphere, its surface, and its interior.
The presentations today demonstrate semantic and connotative shifts of the term Earth over time and space. This places the labor of the historian in a perpetual epistemic quandary, the uncertain imperative of simultaneously knowing what a word means in a contemporary context and trying diligently to understand what it meant some time ago. Add the existential debates of grammarians, linguists, and semioticians about the nature of lexical meaning, and you have a task of redoubled complexity and intricacy. But our speakers have demonstrated that this labor is not to be avoided out of fear of futility, because in the effort alone, important elements of contemporary thinking are surfaced, given a genealogy and problematized in a productive way. There is something particularly relevant therein to the production of architectural and spatial knowledge, and for the task of describing an architecture that is or is not somehow earthly. Today's speakers will present a panoply of new methods of spatial inquiry in an effort to conflate the is and the means of the fragments of our built and unbuilt earthly environment, one that participates in and not against the condition from which it comes, in such a way that it augments and is augmented by other forms of knowing. These semantically and cartographically driven alternative methods proffer a particularly productive model for the collusive relationship between architecture and the greater system of scientific and political thinking that facilitated the conceptualization of the term Earth in the first place. The semantic issue of what architecture is, its internal logic, and means, its external logic, is not a concern without the precondition of Cartesian space, in which we locate architecture to figure its global and local meaning. Cartesian space is, in turn, indecipherable and immeasurable without geographic knowledge. If the unbounded and infinite Cartesian grid were able to graft itself onto the Earth's surface, architecture could very likely be thought in purely formal terms. In addition to determining why architecture looks or acts a certain way, one could also examine its form, its color, its materiality, its relative size, to infer further knowledge about its builder's intentionality and semiotic form. But the Earth's surface is bounded, parceled and obstructed by bodies of water, rivers, and mountains, as well as political, religious, cultural, and economic conditions of all sorts. Architecture's Cartesian fixity is important only insofar as it exists within these geographical and political conditions. Let us briefly turn to the matter of the map. Maps consisting exclusively of political information, national borders, capitals, second cities, etc., were typically found in educational settings for the purpose of developing geographic awareness in students. Maps denoting physical characteristics, bodies of water, mountains, sometimes even crops or climactic zones, were produced for the use of scientists, often for those who were traveling to specific regions and required the information in anticipation of actual encounters with the mapped space. The two were not conflated until the Cold War and fit well within the growing concept of the geopolitical, or the idea that geographical and political knowledge held a symbiotic and not a mutually exclusive relationship. The ground has been laid, as such, for a new kind of world spatial configuration that held in it a particularly important resonance as it applied to the Earth, and, in turn, ways of knowing the architecture produced on it, from it, over it, and or as a representation of it.
So, sorry, I forgot I was supposed to stay up. Beyond the geopolitical, the cartographic, and the technical, today's presentations and discussions will also engage the difference between what Heidegger once defined between the world on the one hand and the earth on the other. To put it very roughly, a world constitutes a set of those aspects of our surroundings that can be culturally apprehended, that can be made into narratives of known relationships and possibilities. The earth, on the other hand, is the material precondition for any world. It resists being boiled down into particular rubrics. It cannot be rendered ready to the hand. And it always contains an excess that is outside of and irreducible to the culture that depends on it. For Heidegger, a creative cultural activity like architecture would necessarily have a connection to both world and earth. On the one hand, a work of architecture comes into being in existing worlds and inaugurates new worlds of its own. Yet architecture also bears the device of its worlding because it is contingent on the physical fundament of the planet. It exposes its own dependence, and with its dependence, that of the worlds it makes and to which it is connected. When we talk about architecture and the earth, we are always, in some sense, talking about that exposure and that inescapable connection. We are examining our discipline's umbilical tether to the stuff of existence. This basic architectural function is what makes oxymoronic jargon, like sustainable development, matter enough to merit confrontation and excavation. What is being sustained in sustainable development and what is being developed? If architecture's relationship to the earth is always a revealing of the worlds we are making for ourselves, then professional participation in fabricating artificial islands on wetlands and air-conditioned towers in deserts, in the face of genuinely self-sustaining and self-developing urban slums, forces us to take such questions seriously. After all, there is something potentially frightening about the so-called rise of the environmental question. Some legitimate worry that the environmental may soon cease to be a question and become a kind of answer we have not allowed for in our domestic ecologies. The possibility of bare life in the face of bare nature, the collapse of our architectural worlds in the face of the full presencing of the earth, is not a future worth sustaining or developing. Perhaps it is helpful to remember that the 19th century English term environment was coined by Thomas Carlyle in an attempt to translate Goethe's formulation of the Umgebung, that which surrounds us, yes, but with the intimation that it surrounds us because we surround ourselves with it. We select it, we encourage it, we intend and tend it. Maybe learning to really think architecture and the earth would mean looking to nature as neither a standing reserve nor a model of desirable forms and processes, but rather learning to select, to feel with nature for the heightened sort of affect or even poiesis that motivates our best sorts of actions, and to work against nature and our nature when these threaten to drag us down to darkness.
Okay, we're gonna now begin our first panel, which is over. No, it's not over yet. It's called Over. To be over the earth can mean to be unbound by its material and physical realities. Rooted in air, weather, and gravity rather than earth, water, and fire, This sphere of our planetary understanding is largely one of the possibilities that rise from the reality and notion of an architectural world unrelated to the Earth. It is no coincidence, then, that architecture situated in the atmosphere with a capital A has a historical and discursive relationship with the atmospheric, that is, the immaterial interests of phenomenology, suppositions of ambiance, conjectures of climate. In other words, that which is less easily imaged or drawn. The ways in which we inhabit the Earth, above the Earth, can also be elementally related to matters of power and domination, as much as they are about sensorial specifics. Planimetrics, that ubiquitous architectural convention, is predicated on a slicing above the Earth's surface, which is enabled by an unbound power to freely slice through steel and mortar as if it was soft cheese. The aerial photograph, a medium facilitated by human domination of time, the photograph, and space, the aircraft, whether through wartime espionage or Google Earth, offers up what we are to believe are the most authoritative representations of our built environment. The colonization of the moon and other planets fulfill frontier myths that engender a sense of power and possibility on a planet that is becoming increasingly impossible, cramped, polluted, and overutilized. The skyscraper, from the Tower of Babel to the Burj Al Khalifa, are part of this tradition as much as they are representations of technocratic accomplishment. There can be something yet more super-earthly about architecture that repels the ground in favor of atmosphere in its formal or conceptual genesis. It is a spiritual ethos, summed up well by John Ruskin, quote, "It is written on the arched sky, it looks out from every star, it is the poetry of nature, it is that which uplifts the spirit within us," end quote. The spirit to which Ruskin refers is atmosphere's capability of ascendance, of uplift, and a canvas of our imagination, hopes, and dreams. Or it is in something entirely more banal, a simple upward vector, tapered and articulated in antennae at the tops of our tall buildings, who in turn communicate with satellites, emit radio and television waves, connect our telecommunication systems, and otherwise build the communities that architecture of Earth simply cannot. I would like now to introduce our first speaker. Nicolas de Monchaux is an architect and urbanist whose work explores the intersection between nature, technology, and the city. He is the author of Spacesuit, Fashioning Apollo from MIT Press in 2011, an architectural history of the Apollo 11 spacesuit. De Monchaux received a BA with distinction in architecture from Yale and his MArch from Princeton. He has worked as a designer for Michael Hopkins and Partners in London and Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro in New York. Until 2006, he was assistant professor of architecture at the University of Virginia, and he is currently assistant professor of architecture and urban design at UC Berkeley. De Monchaux's work has been published and reviewed in Log, Architectural Design, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and have been supported by the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, the McDowell Colony, the Santa Fe Institute, and the Smithsonian Institution. The work of his Oakland-based design studio has been exhibited widely, including at the 2010 Biennale of the Americas and SF MoMA, and will be featured in the U.S. Pavilion of the 13th Venice Architecture Biennale in fall 2012. He has received design awards and citations from the International Union of Architects, Pamphlet Architecture, and the Van Allen Institute, who awarded him the 2000 John Dinkeloo Memorial Fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. Please welcome Nicolas de Monchaux.
Well, that guy sounds pretty impressive, but I'm afraid you're stuck with me. Thank you very much, Marika, Peter, and everyone else here for having me this morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is actually the first time I've been in this building since I was about 12 years old. So and it's a real pleasure. I'm going to talk to you today about space, but not space at all in the architectural sense, or actually space in the architectural sense only at the very end. And what I'm really here to talk to you about is very different ideas of space, space with a capital S, and how I believe the way in which that space was examined, explored, and occupied in the kind of crucible of the mid-century space race, how that particular set of explorations has both repercussions and properties that I believe are particularly informing our current architectural moment today and can usefully and better inform our use of the tools that are in a way the largest legacy of the space race in our own disciplines, tools of charting, mapping space, and constructing objects as systems of interrelated parts instead of as artifacts. But let me not get too far ahead of myself. This work, the work I'm going to show, comes in some part from my book, Spacesuit Fashioning Apollo, and also from a current, very nascent project that I'm sure will bring me back to Harvard, looking at the history of GIS, which in particular, of course, intersects with this building as well. The talk I'm going to give is organized along the themes of the conference. I'm in the over portion, and I'm mostly talking about over, but I will actually very crucially talk about under, and then at the very end about on. So by space in this context, I really don't mean space as it's understood by architects, but this capital S space, which interestingly enough predates the use of the word space to explain this realm by about 300 years. The word space as the space between worlds, the space between planets, was first used by of all people. Oh, I'm not advancing it here, I'm just advancing it on my own computer. Haha. Okay, there you go. That's better. So space, in this sense, was first used by this fellow, by Satan, in Milton's Paradise Lost. And Satan used the word to describe the space between worlds from which new life forms, and in which one only finds angels and then, of course, occasionally demons. This sense of the word space, dating from the 17th century, became used particularly at the very beginning of the 20th century by a range of professions, rocket engineers, aeronautical engineers, doctors, etc., to describe a particular boundary. In each case, while the actual boundary is very different, for astronomers, space begins at about 5 million feet of altitude. For aviators, space begins at about 250,000 feet above the Earth. And for rocket engineers, space actually means about 100,000 feet above the Earth, at the distance from which Joseph Kittinger made the tallest ever parachute jump in 1962. Space in all these realms means a very particular thing, which is the altitude we cannot enter without technology. And of course, this is true for doctors as well, but doctors, physicians of the body, define space most restrictively at all. Above about 15,000 feet, we need oxygen to avoid unconsciousness and death. And above 37,000 feet, we need a pressurized environment, because 37,000 feet, the Armstrong line, as it's called, is the altitude at which water boils at body temperature, and thus your blood is not very happy. So for doctors, therefore, the environment of space is the most restrictive of all, and it was to the mechanisms whereby humankind can enter and ascend to these different kinds of space is the topic of most of my talk today. But I do want to also I think it's very important to present this idea of space in this first context, because I think the Miltonian origins have a lot to do also with how we imbued the properties of, as it were, angels and occasionally demons to human beings that entered this realm. And it also has a lot to do with, I believe, our relationship to technology here on the Earth, and especially how we can examine that engagement with technology in this realm. If space is the space that we need technology in order to enter, it is also the inky backdrop against which we project our hopes, fears, and aspirations about that technology, and particularly its ability to transform our own bodies into something more. In 1961, when Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth successfully, the Soviet Union hid from public view the fact that he had landed only in his spacesuit. In fact, reporting incorrectly up until about 1977 that he had landed in a craft. This was a really interesting omission. Mostly it had to do with the fact that the International Federation Aeronautique would not certify the orbit as the first orbit of the Earth if the pilot had not landed in his craft. But it also had to do with the fact that the Soviet state wished to imbue the launch successfully with its own identity and not necessarily with that of an individual. And yet it was the individual with which the launch became associated. And it was John F. Kennedy, who not incidentally changed his shirt five times a day, who had to figure out how the United States would respond to this particular media spectacle and to the image of Gagarin as a kind of superhuman individual with which the United States had suddenly to compete. It was Lyndon Johnson, titular head of U.S. space efforts, who in a panel convened not only with Jerome Wiesner, the president's science advisor, but Frank Stanton, the president of CBS, who conceived of a manned lunar landing as the prospect, quote, best able to capture the global imagination. And it was Kennedy who commissioned the vast resources of the U.S. budget in order to accomplish that goal. In 1966, the manned space program took a nickel from every tax dollar. But the technology with which Americans first went into space had interesting and, of course, darker roots. This is the Mercury Redstone rocket that Alan Shepard rode to become the first American in a ballistic orbit. And it was, of course, not even a product of the new American space industry, but in fact a modified German V-2 rocket. And you can see, if I go back and forth, that in particularly the firing platform is an identical copy of that of the V-2 rocket, even if the rocket itself has become cylindrical instead of this kind of Tintin shape. The Atlas rocket that John Glenn rode into orbit was, of course, also not originally designed for human occupation, but rather was the first intercontinental ballistic missile fielded by the United States in that ascending crescendo of technological development that formed the 20th century arms race. And so we should probably spend a little bit of time understanding what this object was and what it represented as in both design and technological terms. For that, we need to spend a little bit of time with a new look. Not Dior's new look, although of course it was named after Dior, but rather something called Eisenhower's new look, first announced by Admiral Arthur Radford, chairman of Eisenhower's Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1953, in a speech to the National Press Club entitled The New Look in Defense Planning. The New Look in Defense Planning was a document that had been produced by Eisenhower's defense establishment in the first year of his presidency. And it stemmed from Eisenhower's belief that the vast standing army and the kinds of frozen, muddy conflicts that Korea represented were, in his own mind, something that would be impossible to maintain in the 20th century. Instead, Eisenhower's establishment decided to take the money that would have otherwise gone to the standing army and apportion it to a vast technological enterprise instead. Mostly focused initially on the development of larger and more destructive nuclear weapons, such as the Ivy Mike test of 1962, which blasted out a hole in the Pacific 5 times as wide as the Pentagon and twice as deep as the Empire State Building. But Very quickly, given the inability of any aircraft to sustain itself, to survive the deployment of such a weapon, quickly the enterprise of defense moved to the creation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And not just missiles as objects, but as we can see here, the idea of the missile as system. Now, when the word system first appeared in a description of the Atlas missile project given to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the word, in fact, was so unusual in the English language that a definition had to be provided for it. And a set of examples, such as the Grand Central Railway System, given to the Joint Chiefs to allow them to contextualize the use of such an unusual phrase to describe the creation of this new kind of armament. And the advent of the word system in the design of this object had a very particular origin, which was mostly the fact that the very first Atlas missiles produced by the Convair Corporation, which had been subcontracted to produce them from 1947 to 1954, they just didn't work. But they didn't work in all kinds of interesting ways. The life of the object, that is to say, this was in the conventional means of arms procurement, this was an X-series prototype set of missiles. These prototypes failed, but they didn't fail consistently in the way that a single design feature could amend their functioning. Rather, they failed because a set of subtle, and it was then termed systematic, interactions between their parts. For example, the resonant frequency of the guidance gyroscope in the missile's tip happened to be the same as a turbofan in the rocket engine, and thus the two interfered with each other for a single launch, and so on and so forth. To address these systematic interactions in what was, in fact, the most complicated objects that had ever been made by a human designer, a new method of looking at the making of objects was designed. Interestingly enough, it was a method that Time magazine introduced to its readers through a vision of architecture. The house was like none built ever before, a profile of Simon Ramo and Dean Wooldridge, two of the engineers responsible for the invention of system engineering, began. Doors and windows opened in response to hand signals. They closed automatically when it rained. At night, walls and ceilings glowed softly and changed color at the twirl of a dial. Such a house, Time asserted, is today a reality in the laboratories that are moving deeply into the coming age. So this idea of a responsive environment, of a kind of permeation of an incorporation of technology into architecture and its resulting disembodiment was there from the very beginning of the invention of systems engineering. The US military establishment, Time asserted itself, in such an enterprise is rapidly becoming one vast system. The three figures here are mostly responsible for the invention of systems engineering. The engineers, Dean Wooldridge and Simon Ramo on the right, and on the left, Bernard Shriver, a man who was originally trained as an architect, but whom the Depression forced into the Air Force and became the kind of originating author of a method of black boxes and codified interactions that allowed the effective management of large-scale technological infrastructures, such as the Atlas missile, at the Western Development Division of the United States Air Force, itself housed in a small, repurposed elementary school off the grounds of Los Angeles International Airport. Shriver was responsible in particular for bringing to the enterprise of object creation a new kind of space which had been invented in the context of the Air Force itself in the last 5 or 6 years. This was, of course, the control room. The first control room for the Strategic Air Command, shown here, was simply a soundstage at which maps of the global reach of U.S. forces could be filmed and that television footage beamed to other Air Force bases around the country. But very quickly, what had started out as the soundstage became a kind of stage for action. Not only clerical desks were first inserted, and then computerized consoles that allowed Air Force officers to dispatch and control the forces depicted on here still overhead transparency screens by telephone and other infrastructural links. If this was the front end of the control room also had a really essential back end. The very first control room backend, and indeed the very first real-time computer processor, was of course the Whirlwind, originally designed as originally funded as an airplane simulator. It became the backend of something called the Semi-Autonomous Ground Environment, or SAGE, designed not to control ICBMs but surface-to-air missiles during the period of the Cold War immediately following the Second World War. And the ability of systems such as Whirlwind to process information in real time allowed a kind of one-to-one intersection between the systems engineering methods that were being used to create objects and the systems engineering methods that were being used to dispatch and control forces as well, such that the line between object, system, between making, creating, and deploying became incalculably blurred. This is, of course, the system SAGE depicted here. This is Hanscom Field, and that's actually Cape Ann of the Massachusetts coastline on the display board. These kinds of real-time displays, enabled by real-time computing, allowed for the creation of environments in which the world was brought into an interior and commands dispatched from it in a way that had never been the case before. Also, incidentally, laying the groundwork for the projection of digital mapping, which I can only touch on here today. Control rooms like SAGE were the only model that NASA had for the deployment of its own ICBMs when, during the Mercury program, this space was created in Cape Canaveral that used SAGE hardware as well as real-time display technology developed for the deployment of armaments. When the NASA's Enterprises moved to Houston, the Philco Ford company was contracted to make a large-scale real-time control and command environment, the likes of which had never been seen before, but which would itself become one of the most iconic spaces of the space age. Mission Control, as it became called, was the environment from which all information about the ongoing Apollo mission was collected, and from which all information flowed. It was an environment of screens dedicated to that goal that Kennedy had set, the production of a single image on a single screen seen here, that of an American landing on the moon. And I'm not going to talk to you today about the widespread conspiracy theory that the moon landing was faked, but I will tell you that the screenplay which gave rise to this, Capricorn 1, was in fact hatched between a mission control operator and a young CBS news producer, on whom it was not lost that this was one of the most historic occasions known to the history of mankind, and it was an entirely mediated one made entirely through screens. In fact, the Mission Control Building hid, to a visitor to the Mission Control Building, whether or not the mission being practiced in the Mission Control Chamber was real or a simulation was something that was entirely unknown. The interactions, the information on the screens would be identical. Only this one small switch allowed would determine whether the command and controls would be real or would be simulated. And in fact, most interestingly, to those of us who may have seen Mission Control on television and may believe that we are seeing a single space, there are actually two mission controls. This is the ground floor of the Mission Control Building, and this is the floor above, which is slightly different, and which you will see also includes an identical mission control space. The launch deadlines of the Apollo missions were so dense that missions needed to be simulated at the same time as they were actually being produced in reality. And of course, the simulator was the other one of the other great technological legacies of Apollo, of the space program rather. Simulators, as here in Gemini, were initially analog affairs, but they were increasingly digitized, as here in the enormous simulator architecture of the Kennedy Space Center. Here you see the, I don't know, this is the command module it is hiding there on the right, and the lunar simulator for the lunar lander is over on the left. And it was an environment fundamentally, it was responsible also for this landscape, the very first virtual digital landscape ever encountered by humankind, a three-dimensional landing simulator for the lunar lander developed by General Electric as early as 1962. It could show 256 edges of resolution, thus the craters and features on the lunar surface were encoded as a system of crosses and stripes. But nevertheless, to the astronauts who spent up to 3,000 hours in such simulators, became very real. So before I finish, let me talk a little bit about under and on. The first kind of under I want to talk about is the ground. This was the outside of the mission control building. No prizes for guessing where those two giant windowless spaces are. But this is if those spaces were, if mission control was a kind of twinned space, then it also, the story of mission control also hides a kind of triplet in the basement. This space, the NORAD Control Center, was constructed by Philco Ford at the same time as Mission Control as an identical copy of it used by the Strategic Air Command to deploy, to command and deploy the range of armed strategic forces around the world controlled by the Strategic Air Command, with displays like this one. And it was from this base that activities like this one, Starfish Prime, a nuclear test explosion in the upper atmosphere, were deployed in the early 1960s to test out, for example, whether radiation from such a high-altitude explosion could be conducted via the Van Allen belts to the grain fields of the Soviet Union, thus interrupting global supply chains and extending the kind of command reach of these control environments to areas such as society, economy, and the larger concerns of the Cold War. Of course, I won't spend, I will go through this much more quickly than I do in the book, but the other really interesting question that faced the systems engineers of the Cold War was how, with the advent of the space race, to introduce the human body into these larger systems. The first proposal was for how to do so was made by these two fellows, Nathan Klein, a famous psychopharmacologist, discoverer of the first anti-schizophrenic and MAOI inhibitor drugs used in the United States, and Manfred Clynes, a cybernetic researcher based at the Rockland State Hospital, who in 1961 proposed to the Air Force a concept they called the cyborg, an extension of systems engineering principles under the skin and into the skin of the human body itself, here depicted in Life magazine. And of course, famously used as the basis for the $6 Million Man. The early space race was also the home of studies like this one by the RAND Corporation about how the human body could be codified and extended, and proposals like this one from Litton Industries as to how the kind of mechanical and systems engineering principles of the space race could be shown, could become part of hard constructed environments for the human body in space. This was actually, this is not just Schlemmer-esque, but the engineer depicted here inside the suit, William Elkins, was a student of a Schlemmer disciple at the Chicago Bauhaus before he became an engineer for NASA. The suit on the left here, termed by Michael Sorkin the most beautiful object ever made, and the suit on the right, an antecedent of the Litton suits, were themselves determined to be the coded RX by NASA because they were felt to be the quote-unquote prescription for human travel in space. But the actual story, the truth, as always, is much more interesting. And this is not advancing. There we go. While the Litton Industries suits became the kind of public face of space travel, as in this, the tableau at the very end of the Osaka World's Fair, the actual suit worn by astronauts on the lunar surface, this suit here, or here without its outer protective coating, was handmade and hand-stitched by female garment workers from the Playtex Bra and Girdle Company in Dover, Delaware.
we can do is add an outer layer of things
lose
he
the
does not
sound there?
naturally have. Space medicine showed us
And
where
in order to craft these objects, the women had to introduce 21 different layers of material into each other in a kind of Russian doll, and then hand stitch each layer to 1/64 of an inch tolerance on one side of the seam, and only without the use of any pins or other mechanical devices that might puncture the final suit surface. Of course, for a company like Playtex to be victorious in the suit competition over more conventional military-industrial contractors, other devices had to fail, and fail spectacularly, which they did. When Playtex first made its successfully introduced to NASA its first successful prototype, it was paired. NASA, of course, loved the suit, but felt that a company like Playtex could never possibly survive the atmosphere of the space race. It was twinned. Playtex was twinned with the Hamilton Standard Company, with whom it had what it termed an unsuccessful shotgun marriage. Hamilton Standard then got the Playtex fired because they couldn't work with these underwear people either. And it was only after a successful 6-week competition in 1966 between Playtex, Hamilton Standard, and another military-industrial contractor that Playtex got the final suit. Playtex managed to do this through a kind of informal process of design, not at all the systems engineering approach. Its chief engineer, Len Shepard, had as his only professional qualification the fact that he'd been the television repairman of ILC's founder. And in the end, the most crucial contributions came from the female garment workers themselves, which leads to a particularly interesting relationship to the idea of drawing, which is to say that Playtex had, as part of its contractual requirements with NASA, the need to produce a set of drawings of the suit. But no such drawings could be produced in the process of its actual manufacture because it was not, the knowledge only was in the fingers of the women who assembled it. So the drawings were only produced in retrospect, that is to say, as a kind of dissection of the suit after it was successfully built versus as a prescription of the suit as it was done. When, at the very end of Apollo, Playtex was once again threatened with another manufacturer, it successfully fought it off with this film of a suited engineer in one of the latest ILC prototypes playing that most masculine of games, football, on the Dover High School football field. So I'm a little pressed for time, so I'm going to move very quickly through the last 2 minutes of the presentation. But there's a story to be told about systems engineering on the Earth as well. When Hubert Humphrey spoke in 1968 at the founding of HUD, he declared that the same techniques that put a man on the surface of the moon were going to solve the problems of American cities. And the translation of systems engineering techniques to housing, urban development, transportation, and other government departments was one of the great untold stories of the space race, going from 1969 to about 1972, involving collaborations between HUD, NASA, and many other government departments, and the wholesale movement of tens of thousands of employees. Not incidentally also, the first architectural rendering made using that same lunar lander simulator of a modernist proposal for Los Angeles. And finally, the proposal for cities in space themselves, perfectly balanced, governed by principles from government and industry. A few last speculations. When we think about the relationship between space with a capital S and space with a small s, I think we should particularly think about how the kind of formal and supposedly autonomous disciplines of architecture in the late 1970s and early 1980s inflected today with a kind of pseudo-biological language around coding and scripting for form. How this current state of affairs might be better informed by a knowledge of the difficult and uneasy prospect of the human body in a large-scale technological system in the space race itself. Recalling to my mind not just the body in space, but also the body in the city, particularly the borrowing from by Jane Jacobs from cyberneticist Warren Weaver of the idea of organized complexity. In her words, the kind of problem a city is, and also a body is as well. It also brings us to the last point I wish to make, which is about the idea of fashioning. This is one of my favorite images I uncovered in the research of the book because it so elegantly juxtaposes the kind of masculine image of the fighter jock with the kind of vamping femininity which led to this image being stuck in the bottom of a drawer in Houston where I discovered it. But it shows how the kind of the idea of fashioning, the idea in which the body was had to be adapted into the process, a space needed to be fashioned for it versus made from first principles, I think is very crucial to understanding this history. I also think it's very crucial to understanding the prospect of the body of the Earth in space itself, which this image, one of the last legacies of Apollo from 1972, I think shows a kind of whole environmental utopian prospect. But it's also a bit of a lie, because the image shows the Earth as a giant, Fuller-esque, perfectly designed sphere, and Fuller, of course, used the image on subsequent editions of the operating manual for Spaceship Earth. But the real space we occupy in this image is not the giant sphere of rock which is depicted, but rather the tiny, thin layer of atmosphere on the outside, a much smaller, much more precious space which we need to fashion for ourselves in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. It is my pleasure now to introduce David Gisson. Gisson is a historian, theorist, critic, and curator of architecture and urbanism, and associate professor of architecture at the California College of the Arts. Recent work focuses on developing a novel concept of nature in architectural thought and developing experimental forms of architectural historical practice. David is the author of the book Subnature, Architecture's Other Environments, Princeton Architectural Press, 2009, editor of the Territory issue of AD Journal in 2010, and editor of the book Big and Green, also from Princeton Architectural Press, 2003. He recently completed the manuscript Manhatmospheres, an environmental and architectural history of New York City between the early 1960s and the mid-1980s. His curatorial and experimental historical work has been staged at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, the National Building Museum, Yale Architecture Gallery, Maryland Institute College of Art, Toronto Free Gallery, the Museum of the City of New York, and the exhibition Landscape Futures at the Nevada Museum of Art. He holds a Bachelor's of Architecture from the University of Virginia, an MArch from Yale, and an MPhil and PhD from University College London. Please welcome David Gisson.
This is how I advance this forward. Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much to Marika and Peter for inviting me, and to the rest of the PhD community. It's very nice to be here again today. So I want to show you some images and ideas from one particular chapter of this forthcoming book that Peter mentioned, Manhatmospheres, a title which my publisher completely hates. So if at the end of this talk you can think of something a little bit more interesting for me, I definitely appreciate it. So I'll just move forward because I know we're pressed for time. Okay, so in examining the relationships between atmospheres and architecture, I'm going to discuss some work from this book, Manhatmospheres, Architecture, Environment, and Urban Maintenance. This book explores the rise of the interior architectural atmospheric environment as an urban force within late modern New York City. It examines the importance placed on new forms of architectural interior environments during the city's various post-industrial urban crises, and I definitely put the term crises in quotes. And it examines how these spaces can be considered an extension of New York's famous and ongoing socio-natural project. Manhattan contains all of the West's iconic industrial era socio-natural formations: Olmstedian park landscapes, Moses-era parkways, industrial-era waterfronts, vast water networks, vast water networks, and more. It's what has made this place such a compelling source of study for students of cities and nature. We tend to think that the grandeur and often biophysical orientation of this urban socio-natural project comes undone sometime in the 1960s and 1970s with the collapse of coordinated state and municipal projects. And in many ways, that is true. But instead of completely ending, I believe aspects of this socio-natural project continue, but within the interior environment of buildings. In this, Manhattan remains compelling as it also contains a full array of the West's iconic post-industrial interior environments: verdant corporate atria, sealed apartment and office complexes, hygrographically conditioned gallery halls of mega museums, and vast financial trading halls, among many other examples. While the former industrial era landscapes and networks were often focused on the health of industrial era subjects, the latter become the context for the maintenance of post-industrial subjects and objects. Today, I'll focus on one of the last chapters of this book and talk about the interior atmospheric environments of financial trading halls, in some cases very much repeating some of the imagery that Nicholas just showed, but within an entirely different context, the same sort of mise en scene. Within the socio-natural histories of trading halls, we can detect some shifts in the development of atmospheric and environmental forms, and these support the actors and objects, well, the subjects and objects involved in emerging forms of late modern finance labor. Winning. So I just remembered that this was this image of this film before coming here. Actually, that image on the left is not in the book, but anyway, just if any of you are confused about the kind of spaces I'm talking about, images of the financial trading halls of 1980s Lower Manhattan reveal a landscape of young men surrounded by an array of computers, aggressively and boisterously moving shares of companies and governmental bonds between the respective clients. This activity within this space formed the core structure of the financial services market in New York City. Those that documented the noticeable high-pitched level of activity within these spaces, from journalists to filmmakers like Oliver Stone to authors like Tom Wolfe, these people often remarked on the massive atmospheric artifice that supported financial activity. Journalists, reporters, and critics described the immense electrical loads of the air-conditioned environment and computer equipment through comparisons to small cities or countries. "It's enough power to electrify Guatemala," wrote Wolfe. Or another reporter commented, "The space consumed the energy levels of Schenectady or another small city." Contemporary Lower Manhattan contained most of the trading halls located in the New York metropolitan area, if not the United States. But the development of Lower Manhattan into a site for financial services stretches back to the city's earliest history. The exchange mythically originated under the cool shade of a buttonwood tree in Lower Manhattan, and the New York Stock Exchange became one of the city's and nation's first financial service institutions. Throughout the 19th century, the exchange moved and expanded several times, eventually establishing a permanent space in 1902 on Wall and Nassau Streets. The Stock Exchange was an early and experimental site in the production of an indoor atmosphere that supported the work of the market. One of the first fully functioning air conditioning systems outside of industrial applications in the United States was installed in the New York Stock Exchange to cool the active physiques of the traders. In addition to its engineering significance, urbanistically, the stock exchange was one of the first systems that directly addressed the production of a type of atmosphere to entangle with the physical and psychological impacts of the enervated mass crowds of the city. The coolth generated in trading rooms was imagined as both a counter to the boisterous activity that occurs within trading rooms and as a facilitator of it. This is quite different than an equally innovative and contemporaneous architectural environment, the interior environment of Carnegie Hall, developed by the same engineer Alfred Wolfe, but which cooled crowds at rest. Within the stock exchange, the atmospheric environment maintained financial workers and the stressful maneuvers required on the trading floor. Proponents of indoor air engineering imagined this atmosphere as promoting efficiency and productivity via the removal of sweat, the calming of nerves, and the promotion of individuality. This interpretation of the stock exchange's environment must be seen in partial contrast to the maintenance of labor explored simultaneously in the European and American factory environment. In this latter effort, as Anson Rabenbach has noted, workers were maintained as motors, limited by the exhaustive actions of repetitive tasks. At the stock exchange, air systems were used to maintain workers' physiques, but the subject of these air systems were not conceptualized as machines. Rather, in the realm of financial trading, the workers of the stock exchange function as important facilitators of communication in financial markets. The cooling innovations of the stock exchange promote the expansion of market information between the subjects that form the structure of market interactions. The image of the New York Stock Exchange as a space of uncanny activity matched with massive productions of Kulth continued with the renovations of the hall from the 40s and 50s and in the proposals for new and extensively renovated hall from the 1960s and 1990s. The renovations of the 60s primarily responded to the transformations of the surrounding neighborhood, which became increasingly downgraded. In this sense, both the proposed and actualized trading environment was consistently imagined as a counter-environment to its surroundings, a recurring theme. The renovations of the 80s primarily responded to the increased crowding of traders and the increased computerization of trading. Computers not only required physical space for the processors, cabling, and monitors, but they also produced excessive heat, adversely affecting the mechanical systems of the exchange. By 1980, the indoor environment of the New York Stock Exchange had reached a new level of intolerability due to the crowding of people and trading equipment. A trader, William Higgins, noted ironically, "We don't protect our environment here like industry does. We don't know about noise, light, or air." By the early 1980s, the activities housed within the New York Stock Exchange had extended to the numerous trading halls being built throughout Lower Manhattan. These new trading rooms, often located in monumental postmodern buildings or assemblages of buildings, such as the newly constructed World Financial Center by Cesar Pelli, these were epicenters of computerized trading and large-scale conditioning systems. Via these new trading rooms, the subject of air systems would shift into a more hybrid form, away from a sole orientation on human health and comfort and toward a mixture supporting the human sensorium and the devices that funneled market data, a conjunction that also had certain urban implications. Both the intense heat generation of so many computers and the hybrid needs of people and machines necessitated increased coordination between data engineers and climate engineers. Between 1980 and 1987, mechanical engineering firms such as Fleck and Kurtz worked with telecommunication engineers to rethink the indoor environment of their financial service clients' trading rooms, effectively building the indoor atmosphere of computerized trading. Ultimately, the comfort zone was rethought. Instead of just conditioning the air relative to the number of occupants or the seasons, the conditioning of the air also had to be aligned with peaks and valleys in daily trading activity. Links between human comfort, communications data, productivity, and the future post-industrial city appear most vividly in the design of the trading rooms within the World Financial Center. At the World Financial Center, designed by Cesar Pelli and Associates between 1982 and 1988, American Express, Salomon Brothers, and in particular Merrill Lynch, developed new high-tech trading floors filled at times with over 1,000 traders. Reflecting broader trends, these firms sent approximately one-half of their budgets on various technical services, an enormous shift from the build-outs of earlier corporate interiors projects. Nicholas, we should have compared notes before we came up here. It was very, very interesting, very similar in some ways, very different in others. At Merrill Lynch, each trader sat at a desk with 6 to 8 monitors connected via cabling running through a 2-foot cavity under the floor, all networked into a Bloomberg desktop keyboard. The new expense of these rooms was due to the cost of this telecommunications equipment, but also to the corresponding increase in environmental equipment. While the adjacent World Trade Centers are much larger buildings, the telecommunications equipment at the World Financial Center forced the provision of an additional 2 million cubic feet of refrigeration, far above any other office building of the time. These links between indoor air, financial networks, and the market are significant, but these developments should also counteract any lingering notions we have regarding the immateriality of international financial markets or capital. The seemingly ephemeral market of late modern New York is rooted in increased engineering and industrialization of building structure and interior space. This often involves the production of massive cooling dumps in global cities such as New York, London, and Tokyo that are physically, if not urbanistically, prominent. The urban visibility of the trading rooms in Lower Manhattan reached a climax on October 19, 1987, known as Black Monday, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped in one of the most dramatic profit losses in the history of the American and international stock market. At a loss of almost 1/4 of the Dow's overall value, the drop was the second largest in the history of the U.S. stock market. The crash of 1987 tested the new technological trading floor assemblages and their ability to respond to market crises and panics. In the financial reporting that often forms our impression of trading floors, these spaces were imagined as sites where society produces, responds, and often resolves financial crises. The functioning of these spaces in times of extra-market crises, riots, blackouts, natural disasters, forms core images of a city and region's financial stability. For example, The critical maintenance of the New York financial sector's electrical and cooling network emerged during the blackout of 1981, the first major blackout since the inception of computerized trading. In 1981, a blackout hit lower New York during a day of exceptionally heavy trading, testing the ability of computers, traders, and air conditioning maintenance. As a result of this blackout, engineers developed backup computerized systems and what they described as hardened air conditioning systems that would respond to a variety of infrastructural and economic challenges. The 1987 panic was unique in that it was the first cataclysmic market event in the age of complete computerized trade. The panic of 1987 engaged with the need to maintain flows of information and the computer equipment and the systems used within them. Yet discourse on the panic of 1987 was further complicated by debates regarding whether the smooth flowing of machinery, of computer machinery, mitigated the panic or caused the panic. A middle-class American public, with increasing amounts of investments flowing into trading centers like Lower Manhattan, questioned whether computer programs that automatically sold shares with little human intervention caused the collapse of the market's value. Investment companies argued that such automatic trading, called program trades, enabled their traders to more instantly respond to the needs of their clients, keeping financial trading companies profitable during this tumultuous market activity. The panic of 1987 was the first where the ability to simultaneously maintain digital flows, the nerves of traders, and the atmosphere for computer performance was advanced as a critical project by the financial services industry. In response to these crises, Merrill Lynch, this is their headquarters here as part of the World Financial Center complex, argued that the complexity and internationalism of computerized trading demanded a new relationship between its company and urban infrastructural systems. To further the connectivity of their workers to global communications and to mitigate natural and economic disasters, the corporate tenants of Merrill Lynch demanded that the city facilitate custom regional relationships that enable their operations in the World Financial Center to enjoy an unequal level of premium infrastructure provision. As Merrill Lynch was the largest trader of New York's municipal securities, the development of custom infrastructural links reflected other economic benefits this firm reaped from its relationship with the city. Illustrating ideas of urban theorists Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin, Merrill Lynch's trading room became a splintered space, a space that has its own customized and isolated links to particular locations of this and other cities. Yet we could further link the ideas of Graham and Marvin with concepts from literature on critical environmental interpretation, for example, the writings of Sloterdijk, among others, and we might also see the air-conditioned trading rooms within Merrill Lynch's building as a form of splintered atmosphere. This splintered atmosphere offers financial workers an environment unhinged from the immediate city in ways obvious, but that requires further critical reflection. We might further understand this splintered atmosphere and its critical dialogue with the original and important conditions of this site. The World Financial Center was built on a portion of a larger strip of land known in New York as the Beach. A landfill. This landfill was described by this very conspiratorially minded sociologist, Robert Fish, as a piece of earth that buried the working class industrial harbor under the soil excavated from the construction of the World Trade Center. So the soil came out and poof, on top of this formerly working class site. So this strange land, his theory. That happened, but his historicization of it is conspiratorial. Okay, so this strange landscape became, among other things, a site appropriated by various urban political movements, arts organizations, and theater troupes. This was used as an impromptu beach, but also a site where demonstrations against nuclear arms were held, as well as experimental forms of art and urban dance. Throughout the late 1970s, attempts to develop the entirety of the beach stalled. By 1988, when the World Financial Center was complete on the central portion of the beach, the remainder of the beach to the north and south was considered a veritable wasteland. To the south, where it remained unsodded, it produced sandstorms that swept across the blocks of Lower Manhattan, much to the torment of people who recently moved into this area of Manhattan and/or who worked at the World Financial Center. The interior of the World Financial Center rose above and against this landscape, and if it offered an environment that supported trade, it also offered a more symbolic counter-environment to this place. The beach presented a uniquely late modern form of atmospheric pestilence, the literal atmospheric productions of a prime yet completely undeveloped urban site. In contrast, the World Financial Center contained an atmosphere of pure capital productivity. And if I think I'm on time, but I didn't include this originally because I didn't think I had much time, but the curator for the projects of the beach, as soon as the World Financial Center was completed and before tenants moved in, she commissioned a bunch of artists such as Vito Acconci, Dan Graham, to make work about the World Financial Center, and Vito Acconci proposed driving a car through the curtain wall to release the atmosphere across the beach. And of course, Dan Graham tried to complicate the effects of the curtain wall and to bring the beach into the landscape. So, okay. So finally, standing outside, we should consider one last aspect of the atmosphere of trade, and that is the tops of the World Financial buildings, the iconic pyramid, dome, and ziggurat, probably the most difficult thing to talk about seriously on this building. For some, they illustrated rapprochements between postmodern representational legibility and modernist corporate formal abstraction. Okay. For Mario Gandolsonis, invited by Cesar Pelli to reflect on this project for his monograph, these tops were a provisional system of representation, a momentary cap to contain the potentially infinite and what he called colossal space of the market symbolized by these buildings, an idea recently reiterated in different context by Reinhold Martin. But I think it's important to note that these tops also house some of the largest chiller plants in Manhattan. The dome of the Merrill Lynch building sat above a room that briefly contained the largest air conditioning plant on a corporate building in Manhattan. We might see how this monumental chiller housing, in tandem with the skin of glass that emerges from its more traditionalist base and set against the surrounding landscape, the beach, offers an image of an ascendant and colossal post-industrial atmosphere. This is a late modern recalibration of earlier images of the protected and splintered architectural environment in New York City. And those kinds of images stretch from the ideas of the dome of Buckminster Fuller in Manhattan to the Lomax proposal of Paul Rudolph. Where those spaces protected people from the particular nuisances of an industrial city, the environment within these buildings produces both concepts and subjects of an emerging economy. As this short story illustrates, markets are spaces, systems of communication and technologies, but also spaces for the production of an atmosphere, and I mean that literally, the production of a particular type of urban socio-nature. The interior atmosphere of buildings is always both a representational and material artifact, in this case, of post-industrial economic labor and development. In considering these atmospheres, we might remove any lingering myths or sentiments about where socio-natural production is in our contemporary city. When we do this, I think we'll have a better sense of whom and what we support with our urban productions of nature. The city, its environments, natures, and atmospheres are always there to be reshaped in the most politicized and unnatural ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It is with great pleasure that I now introduce our third and final speaker for this panel. Lydia Kalapoliti, and I hope I have that correct, is an architect, engineer, and theorist, currently assistant professor adjunct at the Cooper Union and Columbia University. She holds a diploma in architecture and engineering from the AUTH in Greece, an SMArc-S in design and building technology from MIT, an MA from Princeton, and is completing her PhD at Princeton. Her research focuses on recycling material experiments and the intersection of cybernetic and ecological theories in the 20th century. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including a silver medal in the W3 International Awards for Digital Innovation and Environmental Awareness, an honor at the 14th Webby Awards from the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences, the Marvin E. Goody Award for the creative use of materials, a Fulbright Scholarship, the Lawrence Anderson Award for the creative documentation of architectural history, the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, and the High Meadows Sustainability Fund. Kalapoliti is the curator and designer of the exhibition Eco Redux, Design Remedies for a Dying Planet, which has traveled globally, including to the Byzantine Museum of Art in Athens, Greece, Columbia University, the Cooper Union, and the Disney Hub of Barcelona in Spain. Parallel to the exhibition, Kalapoliti developed and founded Eco Redux as a nonprofit organization, an innovative online open-source educational resource documenting the history of ecological experimentation in the post-war period and its potential creative uses in contemporary design culture. Please welcome Lydia to the podium.
Thank you so much for inviting me here, Marika, Peter, and the PhD community. And I'm really happy that you got all of us spacemen together to share our research. So I'm going to start with an image that is counteracting the positivist ethos of the spaceman, which is this one. It's Stampo Virile. It was published in Casabella in 1970, and it was a projection of life on Earth in the year 2000, while looking at it from architectural publications in 1970. And this is in the same line of several publications that projected fearful representations of the future Earth. And as you see, the quote in Earth magazine is, "We're all trapped in an Earth that is coming down. It is suffocating." So the Earth is projected as bean-shaped, despherified, jaggedly contoured, internally disemboweled, and most of all, entirely covered by cement. These nervous planetary visions originating from the little leftover space as counted in square meters, as well as mounting levels of pollution at the time, were eventually exacerbated when NASA released images of the whole Earth to the public eye. Suddenly, mankind could witness a setting from the outside as a collective mirror image, which fundamentally changed perceptions of space. Within the finite Earth, space was now subject to circular feedback, and in the very known work of Bucky Fuller, John McHale, and Ian McHardt, the planet was understood through the mechanics of comprehensive resource management, while the Earth in its totality served as a new stage of action, reasoning backwards, I argued, to a colonial and empirical modality. Most importantly, this kind of work estimated a systemic analysis of the universe where all patterns were imagined as interlinked in a master plan of natural order. This type of organizational unity was anticipated in Alexander von Humboldt's massive Cosmos trilogy in the 19th century, but took clear cognitive form in Ludwig von Bertalanffy's general systems theory in the 1950s. In systems theory, the universe was presupposed as a system of nested subsystems, a model which served not only theoretical biology and the hard sciences, but also as a description of society itself. And here we see the famous movie Powers of Ten, which brings this discourse to the popular public. In these conditions of holistic thinking, a new environmental consensus emerged in the post-war period. It was in the form of a synthetic naturalism where the laws of nature and metabolism were displaced from the domain of wilderness to the domain of cities and buildings. Previous concepts of nature's careful preservation as separated from the urban milieu gave rise to a novel naturalism of artificial ecology where the functions and operations of nature were copied as precise analog in man-made systems. The site for this new ecological model was a household, as well as the reinvention and reconstruction of domestic economy as both a scientific and an ontological project. The design of a house as a synthetic ecology suggested that a house would become a copy or a reproduction device of a natural ecosystem, a system of mechanized interrelated parts as a model or a piece of nature, a microcosm of the earth. This shift was very much related to the ecologist appropriation of a specific scientific language and a set of tools used by cyberneticians in the post-war period. By diagramming the flow of energy in the natural world as input and output, circuits in a feedback loop, cybernetician provided ecologists with new research techniques and a new biologically informed but also computational theory of inhabiting the world. In many respects, the projection of humanity in outer space was less about conquering a new physical and technological frontier, but more about the reflection of these principles down on Earth, and the conception of a new type of recirculatory house, which was a cybernetic laboratory. These are three case studies that I will present today as recirculatory systems, going from the space program to the spin-off program of the space program to the building industry, back to an ecological early house in England. What I would like to underline is that closed regenerative systems are falsely assumed as causal symptoms of the oil crisis and issues exclusively related to energy saving. Recirculatory systems illustrate emerging architectural concerns related to habitation. First, a new integrated structure with man, the physiology of injection and excretion becomes part of the system that he inhabits. Second, closed systems are organizational divisions of closed-loop cycles and are therefore computational systems, namely recursive models that generate complex behaviors. Finally, closed systems demonstrate an ontological problem of a protective environmental enclosure, which was very much demonstrated in the talk of Nicolas de Monchaux. This spatial paradigm, similar to the bubble space of the astronaut suit, can be described as an ecosphere, as German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk coins it, alluding to a novel territorial paradigm in the 20th century that he coins as modern individualism. So going to the first episode, we are going to go to 1960 and the NASA Langley space station, which collaborated with General Dynamics Convair to manufacture an experimental life support facility known as the NASA Living Pod. They created a hermetically sealed steel structure contained a prototype, which was designed to take care of the basic physiological needs of 4 men for a full year with minimal resupply of food once every 3 months. And this was done prior to launching space shuttles in outer space. The development of this experimental facility was monitored and videotaped, kind of like an early Big Brother movie. And it became NASA's first promotional educational picture for television entitled Living in Space, The Space for Regeneration. The film began with a heroic statement about the virtues of men, and here's a quote. It was inevitable that man, the insatiable explorer, would build a stairway to the stars where the conditions are unfriendly to his biological system. Man managed to go into the vacuum and experience all these strange conditions of weightlessness and return himself safely to the blanket of air. End quote. We have to imagine this at the moment of the Cold War and the space race. But what I want to underline is that the key to the colonization of this uncharted territory of outer space was no longer in the invention of rockets and technology gadgets, but in the management and reinvention of human physiology. To transport men into outer space, he could only go along with his artificial environmental Earth bubble. As we can witness from this film and several other promotional diagrams from NASA, a new biological informed image of man was emerging, one where human agency was instrumentalized in terms of input and output. At the same time, the diagrams that NASA made illustrate man entirely bound to his surrounding environment, since only with the service of different machinery like digesters, converters, dryers, and dehumidifiers could all cycles of ingestion and excretion be closed and redirected back into the body. These diagrams from the motion pictures were reproduced in several architectural publications, including Architectural Design, Bow, Adhocism, and other magazines, portraying a new vision of man and the space he was residing, as if tied to walls and parts of the contained space with an umbilical cord. In many respects, we can review architects' drawings of men as a medium to project perceptions of architecture in different time periods. Thus, the Vitruvian man, enclosed in a circle, speaks of a period of geometrical supremacy. Le Corbusier's modular speaks of a measured on an external reference line, speaks of a period of proportions. Now, the astronaut projects the materiality of the body dissolved into a series of flows and feedback loops. However, this new image of man comes at a high, almost deadly cost in the resurgence of the primitive fear that a man could be buried in the combustion products of his own body. In case of a systemic malfunction, excreting could kill him or contaminate his immediate environment. In this sense, the system needed to be highly invested in the process of total regeneration. Material loss could simply not be allowed. Space was no more than in the faithful servicing of closing all feedback loops. In the enclosed environment where the 4 men were sealed inside the simulator for extended periods of time, the men experienced nausea, headaches, and eventually contaminated the system with their human waste. Shed hair, fingernails, and skin infiltrated the collectors. Eventually, the subjects had to be removed from the cabin earlier than the expiration date of the experiment. What is important to observe in this case is that the men did store their waste in the designated compartments after conducting their daily personal hygiene routine as instructed in the feedback diagram. However, floating waste material, so finely ingrained that it could not be incorporated in the process of recirculation, escaped and eventually randomly merged in new contaminants. Therefore, contaminants may be considered as new bodies produced by the system as free-floating energies left over from the transference process, which crystallized in new specimens of materials. Captain Robert Freitag, which was deputy director of the Manned Space Flight Center at NASA at the time, declared later on in a conference at Princeton University that much is yet unknown in many areas of interaction associated with the development of a closed ecosystem. Algorithms must be developed to define the basic supporting relationship of man, animals, plants, and microorganisms, and to define the condition under which ecological closure could potentially exist. This area could prove to be the single most demanding technology to be developed in our century, and as Stuart Brand later on described it after 10 years of experimenting with self-reliant ecosystem, he described it as a kind of hysteria. These are some more images of the closed experiment in the NASA's educational movie. So moving on to the second episode, again in the later 60s, we are going to see how NASA developed several spin-off divisions for terrestrial applications. It was suggested that spacecraft hardware could be directly employed in the building industry, yielding ecological benefits and rendering the house as a life support system. This relocation of services resulted in the promotion of the house as a new type of machine, a performative machine, replacing the kind of modernist ethos of function with performance. And most importantly, it was this type of technology transference that was delivered as NASA's gift or original contribution to the optimization of architectural design. At the time, Grumman Corporation was a leading firm associated with space research, primarily specialized in bioastronautics, human performance, life support systems, and the habitability of future space stations. Grumman was highly invested in the development of lunar technologies and space stations, but they were equally interested in projecting their inventions for outer space down to Earth. And this is their logo of advertising their corporation in a string of advertisements that were published in several publications, including the International Journal of Science and Technology, between 1964 and 1967. Certain experiments in spacecraft life support systems could not be successful in zero-gravity conditions, mainly due to difficulties of directing bacteria and microzoa flow for anaerobic digestion in waste consumption, but there were not the same problems for terrestrial applications. So the corporation consulted with several architectural firms in the late 60s to design a modular housing unit, a waste disposal system, a sewage system, and an energy efficiency system for homes for the civil consumer market. These applications transferred from technologies initially used for life support systems for spacecrafts, sold a considerable number of units in the U.S. labeled under the title Grumman's Integrated Household System. Moreover, Grumman's way of connecting different apparatuses into an integrated building circuit was promoted as a remedy to environmental problems. In 1969, Grumman offered the research program on life support systems for domestic use to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, an organization charged with the development of improved housing system concepts for large volume production and the construction of 1,400,000 new dwellings. Offsetting NASA's specific techniques to the building industry, however, resulted in a new kind of fixation with biological substances and physiological flows in the design of the household. Using NASA's conversion diagrams for spaceships as a starting point, every solid and liquid waste stream was segmented and decomposed to its other constituent in a kind of tenuous plan to produce drinkable water from collected droplets and oxygen from carbon dioxide and water vapor. Towards the ideal system that would have no waste, all human waste was hoped to be treated chemically and to be dissolved into base data, such as the prime strings of proteins and ideally to atoms, which would be reconstructed in new combinations. This approach, labeled as atomic recycling, was founded on the hope that substances could be reconfigured in an atomic level, that matter could dissolve in basic information agents and regrown chemosynthetically of solid and liquid wastes. To take this argument further, wish fulfillments are fundamental to recycling diagrams, if we may borrow Freud's terminology. Even in NASA's most pragmatic graphs for the operation of spaceships, desire plays a key role in the completion of the diagram by filling in the blanks and legitimizing fuzzy conversions. To understand this claim, we may take as an example the General Dynamics life support systems, which is an iconic graph. Oh, I showed that earlier, so I don't know if we can go back to that. But it was the black one with the Vitruvius Man above it. And that diagram was iconic because it carried out a three-step mission. First of all, it segmented all input into constituent component parts. Then it mapped relationships between parts to create a kind of systemic reciprocal organization. And third, it redirected. It gave a new channel for all input to become output, and again, input. What the diagram, however, failed to explain was the nature of material conversions that were necessitated to chemically resynthesize materials from one state to another. One has to keep in mind that the proposed conversions do not merely involve phase changes such as solid to liquid to gas, but also impossible responsibilities such as turning shit into food, and this is precisely where wish fulfillment becomes part of a conversation. Operating under the assumption that a coherent systemic organization can be implemented to any material system, the two recycling diagrams contain several black holes that could only miraculously be accomplished. In the iconic graph, these holes are visualized as conversion bubble-like machines that contain complicated interior mechanisms. They're extra devices added to the system, designated to mediate flows and assume the responsibility of converting all substances using techniques of drying, rotating, dehumidifying, electrifying, filtering, oxidizing, etc. Under the pseudonym Rupert Spade, Martin Pauly wrote a piece in 1970 in AD called The Trick Recyclist, and what he wrote was the black holes of closed systems. Pauly described the experiments of a guy called Edward Burden, who between 1960 and 1966 patented several mechanisms related to a biological waste treatment system in order to adapt his waste recycling system for use undersea or in space. To develop his inventions, Burden was in touch with the Grumman Corporation in the early 60s and offset the industry's smart technologies to homemade reprocessing systems, managing the dubious accomplishment of nourishing adequately 1 duck, 15 goldfish, 1 apple tree sapling, an apricot tree, a panlet, and a small rhododendron plant, only from household effluent. With a number of conversions, oxidizing, and permeation devices, Burden's system eventually became commercially available in the U.S. in the early 1970s, promising to clear off effluents and then grow tomatoes. What we're less aware of is what happened in due course to Burden's flora and fauna after running his biological waste treatment system for extensive periods of time. This inquiry derives from the fact that all recycling systems, especially the aspiring ones that do not have any waste, are absolutely closed systems that redirect all input into output, and as such, they're more than likely to exhibit unpredictable behaviors like the production of new substances, not calculated from the internal organization of the system itself. Closed autopoietic systems derail from an original systematized scheme that runs invariant perpetually. Instead, they are prolific of new subsystems that feed the original system with new input, constantly changing its internal organization. And this is something explained by Maturella and Varela in the second cybernetics theory. Pauly's stark criticism of the recycling process in closed systems is very much related to his own frustration with the movement of garbage housing, which conceptually fulfilled also a circular system in a planetary scale by feeding industrial byproducts into the cycle of building production as new building materials. It seems that the architect's desire to close the circle was eminent. However, noiseless recycling is an impossible enterprise in time, or an ecotopia, and if portrayed as a realistic task, it would undoubtedly need to combine high-tech devices with some wishful thinking. And I'm moving now to the third case study, which is not above the earth, but very much on earth, and it is one of the earliest ecological houses in Eltham, out of London, in South London. It was built in 1972 as a laboratory and a living experiment by Graham Kane, which you see on the picture, who was a member of an anarchist group in London called the Street Farmers, originally formed by Peter Crump and Bruce Haggard. The eco-house was a fully functional integrated system that converted human waste to methane for cooking, as well as maintained a hydroponic greenhouse with radishes, tomatoes, and bananas. At the time that it was built, and it no longer exists, of course, Kane was a 26-year-old fourth-year student at the AA in London. He designed and built the eco-house on borrowed land from Thames Polytechnic as part of his diploma thesis at the AA. He received a provisional 2-year permit from the Borough of the Woolwich District Surveyor with a promise to build an inhabitable housing laboratory that would grow vegetables out of household effluents and fertilize the land with reprocessed organic waste. He got a £2,000 fund from the chairman of the AA at the time, Alvin Boyarsky, and with scavenged materials on the street, he settled in the house with his family in December of 1972. After having lived in the house for 2 years with his family, Kane was asked to destroy the house in 1975. By that time, the eco-house had received wide attention from the British press and architectural magazines, as well as considerable attention in British television. It was the main subject of a documentary called Clearings of a Concrete Jungle in BBC in 1973. And it was published in several other publications with titles including The House That Grows, A Revolutionary Structure, A New Way of Living, Living Off the Sun in South London, and other titles. Throughout the construction process, Kane used himself and his family as a guinea pig in order to test the function of several components of the house. He carefully studied all of NASA's manuals to put together and assemble all the pieces of the house, and experimented with his waste, his cooking habits, the use of water, monitoring closely every activity of daily practice until the day the house was demolished in 1975. Kane was undoubtedly the steward of the house. He alone knew how to feed the house with the right nutrients, how to chop wood, grow plants, supply the engines, and water the greenhouse. The architect was therefore an indispensable biological part of the house that he built and portrayed himself, as you can see in this diagram, as a combustion engine for generating electricity connected to the house in a way to assume the responsibility, connected to the house in a very vital way. I lost my pages, it's okay. In many respects, as he was also describing it in his publications, the house was more grown than it was constructed. It needed care from its caretaker, and without human presence, its living biotechnical systems would degenerate and die. Describing his house as a life support system, Kane satirically argued that the architect, now being involved in the house's biological cycles, could better relate to his own shit. This type of absolute connection on a daily basis to assure the wellness of the house was recognized by Kane, who rarely left the house. Robin Middleton, who was technical editor of AD at the time and a colleague of Kane at the AA, humorously spoke of a Gordian knot between Kane and this house. He recalls that Kane never left the house in order to assure that all systems were working properly. At some point, he had to leave the house for some reason. His mother was sick or something. And he had to train his favorite student at the AA to look after the house to make sure that all systems would work properly. According to Middleton, everyday housekeeping habits affected the health of the house and vice versa. In order, the house's wealth was entirely codependent with the dweller's health in an interlinked biological pattern. In this case, self-sufficiency of the eco-house becomes a political statement against consumerism and capitalism. It becomes a grain of resistance against the state's network of centralized control. According to Kane, capitalism could be illustrated in a linear scheme, while the recycling of organic matter, the collection of rainwater and sunshine, that in turn produces food, gas, and heating, represented an alternative political reality of cyclical behaviors where material could be used and reused perpetually. In many ways, the detachment from urban supply networks depicts a collective repudiation of the urban condition, which is portrayed by both the counterculture and the space program as a catastrophic environment that restrains the imagination and the freedom of the individual. In this sense, the house, detached from the city, was in many ways an island. It was unrooted from its urban context, like a planet of its own, but very much in exchange with physiological parameters, monitoring temperature, water, light, humidity, and calculated in numeric data. We may perceive this detachment outlined as an ecological and political imperative and a fundamental reorientation of the house in relationship to its urban condition. Weaving Kane's political assertions to the premises of the NASA Langley simulator, it is striking to observe how the same cybernetic prescription of a system migrates from a military complex to a countercultural political theory mediated through entirely different ideological lens. On the one hand, NASA's scenario for self-sufficiency comprises a project of technological supremacy and regards mostly the invention of hardware in order to conquer a new frontier, now visible and detectable to our eyes. The colonial modality is evident in this aspiration to master the new land or space even without any oxygen. On the other hand, the equipped interior of the eco-house is portrayed as the fantasy of an exterior to the political reality. The interior, equipped with digesters, become a strategy of political autonomy to withdraw from the tentacles of society and the state's organizational infrastructure, away from the networks to which people must yield. As seen as in the NASA Langley simulator and the eco-house, an ideal and its exact opposite represent two very different political realities and existential problem, but come to be expressed by the same strategy of self-reliance. The ongoing experiment of the enclosed ecosystem, or the ecosphere, despite all odds, was ceremoniously revived in the massive Biosphere 2 project in Arizona, which was completed and sealed in 1991. Not surprisingly, fresh air had to be pumped and food introduced into the sphere to ensure the health of the sealed subjects. But even beyond the ecological tourist attractions of the Biosphere 2, we may argue, and I guess this is where I should compare notes with David Gissen, that the spaceship lives within the thousands of sick buildings of corporate America. Sealed, heavily air-conditioned buildings usually generate problematic airborne conditions resulting from a building's lack of exchange with its surrounding environment. In most sick buildings, there cannot be an identifiable cause for illness as a causal effect of a specific deficiency. A 1984 World Health Organization committee report suggested that up to 30% of new and remodeled buildings worldwide may be the subject of excessive complaints related to indoor air quality and suffer from what is known as to be the sick building syndrome, a term describing situations in which building occupants experience acute health and comfort effects linked to the time spent in a building. The recirculatory household that reproduces the earth at the same time negates the earth and nature. Nature is segmented and sampled, and therefore the idea of earth is reconstructed out of partial objects. It represents in this sense a meta-earth in the process of its representation out of fragments. Despite the larger objective for connection with a planetary system of references, the recirculatory house is irreverent to a greater master plan as an overall design and is composed by an algorithmic process of local adjustments. In this system, complexity is not produced by genius, inspiration, determination, or evolution of an authored idea, but is simply made out of actions of organic substitutions, which cannot be caught up in any mystique of creation. At the time, this was a telling blow to the architect's canonical training, promoting a practice of editing versus one of authorship. It signaled a crisis where the object of the discipline underwent a fundamental deappropriation of its normative tools. In a recent conference at NASA in Washington, D.C. in 2007, a common consensus surfaced in honor of the 50-year celebration of outer space research. Officers and researchers claimed that the space program's greater accomplishments were not what they were intending to be. It was not the conquering of the new frontier and the actual moon landing, but the space program's side effects. Such were the photographs of the Earth. Likewise, this successful derailment, an incidental side effect produced as a discipline undergoes a transformation, may suggest an alternative reading of architectural history, not by offering actual objects and a new paradigm, but by suggesting new tools and new modes of practice. These objects may be fictional, impossible, or in the best-case scenario, ephemeral, but architecture is mostly a project of imagination. The objects can be ephemeral, but the tools and the modalities of design creativity that they produce are not. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. And before proceeding to discussion and inviting all of our speakers back to the table, I would like to first begin by introducing the panel's moderator, K. Michael Hayes. Michael Hayes is Elliott Noyes Professor of Architectural Theory here at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and co-director of the doctoral programs, both PhD and DDes. He teaches courses in architectural history and theory. Hayes has played a central role in the development of architectural theory in North America, and his work is internationally known. His research and scholarship have to date focused on the areas of European modernism and critical theory, as well as theoretical issues in contemporary architectural practice. He has published on the work of modern architects such as Hannes Meyer, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, and Mies van der Rohe, as well as on contemporary figures such as Peter Eisenman, Bernard Tschumi, and the late John Haydock. Hayes was the founder of the scholarly journal Assemblage, which was a leading forum of discussion of architectural theory in North America and Europe. In 2000, he was appointed the first adjunct curator of architecture at the Whitney Museum of American Art, a position he held until 2009. Hayes received the Bachelor of Architecture degree from the Georgia Institute of Technology, a Master of Architecture degree in Advanced Studies, and a Doctor of Philosophy in the History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture and Art, both from MIT. Please welcome Michael and our speakers to the table.
We have about half an hour, and what I propose is try to get more of a discussion and find some commonalities and common structures and themes rather than a kind of Q&A. And if I could maybe propose a framework. None of you mentioned the word utopia, unless Lydia said it as I slipped out to the men's room, but otherwise I didn't hear the word utopia.
And ecotopia.
You did say ecotopia. Okay, sorry. I knew I would miss something. But I want to propose that actually maybe there's a kind of latent utopian impulse in the three papers, in the material that the three papers presented. But to get at that, let me first make a distinction between what we might call a utopian program, and by that I mean, kind of prescriptive texts prescriptive utopian texts, which maybe Lydia Graham Kane gets close to, but also a utopian program in the sense of a kind of intentional communities that form with like survivalist or something like that, that form with some intention, and distinguish between this utopian program and what we might call utopian desire or utopian impulse. And that would be somehow underlying or be an integral part of everyday life, but latent. And we would need some kind of special analysis to bring it forward. And that's what I'm thinking that one might detect. And if I could, if just as a way of discussing, if you could, in your minds right now, do a kind of rebalancing from content to form. There was a lot of content in the three papers. There was actually very little general analysis of form, or there were a lot of forms. But if we could shift that, and understanding, as we talked about a little bit yesterday, that form is always a form of some content. And this is what I want to get at. What is the form of some content that we might call utopian? And I want to suggest, and it's very obvious, but just to get it out as the frame, three key forms, I think. First of all, closure. All three papers talked about various kinds of autonomous environments that formerly were completely closed, from a spacesuit with its own, and this is one thing I'm not quite sure about, whether the spacesuit is plugged into some external support or whether it's kind of internalized, like some of the things that Lydia was showing. But in any case, I think there was a kind of closure, whether it's mission control or the trading room or the spacesuit itself, or Lydia's the modern version of or the 1960s version of a Vitruvian man who is enclosed in this. And then the second, I'm thinking about this, the thing about closure. In Sade, Fourier, and Loyola, in the chapter on Sade, Roland Barthes makes this point that Sade's utopia is enabled by the closure of his apparatus, right? Because it's completely internalized, that produces utopia. So that's just something I have in mind. And then the second thing, and I want to put it in a way in tension with closure, is the idea of system. And this is the interconnected, but I'm trying to make those opposite. I'm saying there's a closure, the form of closure on the one hand, and then there's some idea of system which connects the autonomous environments, these encapsulations, to some larger, almost want to say global, and especially in Nicholas's paper, one truly believes sort of galactic system, that the system I'm talking about is really big. And that this combination of closure and system, for me, the thing I would then question is that combination a kind of impossible or attempt? Is that an attempt to figure some impossible totalization? That what's really wanted here is a kind of totality, a model of an environmental totality that includes all different kinds of materials and flows and vectors and unifies them all together into a complete totality. Totality, I'm thinking of it, would be like a combination of closure and system, right? System and closure together produces this impossible totality. And then just maybe these protean atmospheres, these different changing, sometimes uncertain, sometimes evolving notions of atmosphere actually become allegories of totalization. That atmosphere itself is the way an impossible totality is figured, and that's what atmosphere ends up being, and that's atmosphere's utopian impulse. So yeah, discuss amongst yourselves.
Can I say?
A dawdle.
So I in principle, I agree with. Hang on, 1 second. In principle, I agree with the distinctions between a sort of, an idea of I don't know if I use the word form, but let's say a thing versus a space of vectors or flow. So I totally am on board with that distinction, and I think at least within within this particular historical project, but I also think when I'm wearing my architectural theory cap, that distinction is something that interests me quite a bit. And I think the historical project for me is less to connect thing and flow, but to demonstrate that what we understand as flows are in fact things, and that to turn these things into objects and representational objects is the political project. That by understanding the interior of an office building or a spacesuit or what have you, or the interior of any number of projects, as something other than this naturalistic vectored representation, which I personally have a lot of problems with, and begin to bring it into what historically is the language and the discourse and the discussion of architectural autonomy. To make environment a thing, for me, is a political project. Is that a utopian project? That I can't answer, but I think I definitely am on board with that distinction. But I think rather than for me, the politicized historian's job is not necessarily to connect the closure to the system, but to show that every system, in fact, is some kind of bounded representational system.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
I would say that I think it's a really great framework for the several papers that you put forward. I think one point that I'd try and make clear, if I did so inadequately in the actual presentation, which is that I really figure that intimate space around the body as a zone of extreme conflict between differing visions of systems and objects and the human body's role in them. I think one of the things that I didn't have time to talk about but that I was very tempted to bring up was the various moments where the boundaries between the human body and that global system of mission control were sundered. Most fascinatingly, for example, during the crisis of Apollo 13, when the astronauts felt that they were close to death in this environment, the system had broken down.
Mm-hmm.
They needed to remake it and reassemble it, and a kind of maker faire in space to kind of, and they pulled out all the kind of rectal thermometers and heart. They kind of broke. There's this really interesting line in the mission transcript where they just broke the connection. They didn't want anyone. They figured if they had moments left to live, they didn't want someone on the ground on a screen knowing exactly how their body was responding. So it was a very primal desire to sunder that goal. And then more kind of comically, during the last Skylab mission, the astronauts who were endlessly programmed in 5-minute cycles throughout the day. They resisted. They grew beards that they were not allowed to do in space. They complained a lot about the atmosphere of They said that all the browns were getting to them, the way it was all designed, the brown of their clothing, the brown of all the cabinets, and they sundered the community. They turned off the radio to mission control for 24 hours, and a Harvard Business School study called it the strike in space. And it was this really and what they spent most of their time doing was actually looking at the Earth. And they all became committed environmentalists, and they kind of restaged their hearing to Congress after the fact to be this environmentalist manifesto, which nobody came to because it was the end of the space race, and no one was interested. So it was this real, I'd say this kind of conflict between this totalizing system and the kind of intimate space of the body is one of the most fascinating kind of battlegrounds, I think, of this line between utopia and reality. And I see it also in the history of Operation Breakthrough, which Lydia referenced, this attempt to restage the technologies of NASA for housing. And it came through, you didn't talk about, but I can't resist talking about what happened to that pneumatic sewage system when it was installed in the Operation Breakthrough site in New Jersey, which was that it started running in the opposite direction. Unexpectedly one day.
Everything went wrong
with kind
in
of,
these utopias.
I think the GAO report called it malodorous results, but that was an understatement. But it was cited by the GAO, Operation Breakthrough, for having absolutely no positive impact on the human environment on Earth. That was this kind of, and yet then the last kind of fascinating spectacle of it is that proposal that I showed briefly for a 10,000 person city at Lagrange Point 3 in between the Earth and the Moon, that was not sphere-like, but it was the cylinder of the kind of 2001 style spacecraft, in which they said, but here all these techniques will work because we'll have it, we'll the classic utopian prospect of this new city in a new place. that it will interestingly work. And so the last note I'll make about form, I think the kind of idealized form of utopia is the sphere or the cylinder in this context. That was the kind of pressure vessel. But the battle in spacesuit design was that the body is not a sphere, and it's not rigid. And so the kind of more informal pneumatics, I thought again when Lydia showed the gas mask of kind of like the ant farm inflatables that resisted a kind of easy, that were all about a kind of uncertain form. That is much more, to me, subtle and the interesting legacy of the period.
I just, what I'm fascinated with all these stories from the space program and their applications to terrestrial applications is that they were imagined as little utopias, which is a word I've been eloquently avoiding, but everything went wrong. Everything. All of these missions, all of these stories of monitoring, just like you mentioned with the breaking of the sewage system, going to the opposite direction, with the kind of simulators where the men that were sealed in the simulator experienced nausea and they started fainting, and the biosphere, which was, as we all know, a failed experiment that cost federal government billions of dollars. So this is the fascinating. There are two issues, and I think you were absolutely right, Michael, to point out that it's a system of totality, and that utopia has a lot to do with detachment from an existing reality. It's almost like a level above the existing reality that is detached and is reinventing a system of environment and habitation detached from the conditions of reality. It's almost like a kind of parthenogenesis, which is a Greek word that I like to use a lot, which is inventing a kind of surreal condition extant from physical resources. And as proven, the connection with as proven with all these instances, it is something that in its application completely failed. But what I'm mostly interested in these moments is, first of all, it's the context, the theme of these stories in the post-war period. But I'm interested in the kind of moments of closed histories or bubbles of events that were a little bit unrelated with the canonical discourse of the time, and kind of looking at them today and how much this kind of systematization of thought and the design process could relate in a different time period. And this is another let's say, interpretation of these closed worlds, not only as kind of things and context, but also as kind of representative of moments that in time were utopic, but visiting them in a different time period, there's a different type of correlation. And in regards...
You mean from the way these things that you showed have been appropriated by contemporary environmentalism? Or is that...
Yes, yes. I mean, how much these because it's super clear that the form, let's say, speaking of form, because it was addressed through your question again, what surfaces is not only the form of the cylinder and the sphere as a kind of physical apparatus or container, but the ideational form of the circle as closing the systems through feedback. So to me, this is the form that kind of surfaces from this conversation. The circle as a kind of, which is the real utopia, that everything could be redirected to everything else without loss. And this is exactly what was referenced to earlier, I think, by Marika as the jargon of sustainability is basing its current discourse. So there's a cycle of events, not only through the actual objects, but ways of thinking and operating. And I think that's what's mostly fascinating to me today.
No.
Can I play the Marxist for a minute and respond to that?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
thanks.
go ahead.
That's a fun role.
I
right?
like Marxism.
So, I mean, one of the things that struck me with both that idea that you just presented, and then also the slides that you showed of the NASA enclosed environment and then the house, is that how sort of purely Marxist it is in some way. Like, sorry, let me back up. Where you might see a kind of curious historical coincidence, I almost see like a very classical Marxist interpretation in which the Marxists would say we must appropriate the technological apparatus and reproduce our society with it, right? Whether it's the proletariats in Russia in the early 20th century, or if it's the military-industrial complex in the U.S. And that it's not, for me, it's not, there's not so much Fisher there, but a kind of very orthodox logic, which, if anything, might show some of the limits or the weaknesses of an orthodox Marxist versus a neo-Marxist interpretation of appropriating technology for social betterment.
What is the orthodox and what is the neo?
Well, orthodox would just say if you create a computer to create global trading, that me and my oppressed brethren will seize the techniques of power. Whereas a more modified, or let's say a post-Foucauldian Marxist view would see power everywhere, and that we can't just simply take this system of power and use it, but something more complex has to happen. That we have to be aware of our own systems of power and how they come into play and our own kind of discourses. And in that case, Ant Farm is an example of I mean, I don't think Chip or any of the Ant Farm members would ever use this term, but a more sort of post-structural appropriation of military and industrial technology, because they also
and iconography.
Yeah, because they also demonstrate the way it's mediated in systems of communication, so that there's that extra layer. It's not just seizing it, but it's representing how those systems appear to us in the first place.
Can I play the pragmatist?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, but I get to stay playing the Marxist.
Okay, no, I'll stay in character too. I think this appropriation of kind of NASA technology for housing. You know, on the one hand, it makes a very interesting narrative to say these guys want to take over the world, et cetera, but it's part of a larger, Greek in the classical sense narrative, in that the real reason why you had Operation Breakthrough existed and why you had this attempt to for instance, there were summer schools at Berkeley and MIT in 1971 to train NASA managers for urban development.
Yeah.
It has a lot to do with New York in the 70s with the RAND had an office in the Lindsay administration that tried to actually worked a lot on the heating and air conditioning of the city, on the systems, on the water and things like that. But the real reason why was just Vietnam, which is to say that there was this kind of financial and logistical cancer on the defense budget, on the defense and aerospace budget that kept growing and growing, and was itself a kind of there were like IBM mainframes and bunkers computing all the ways in which it was supposed to go and yet not going. And that was there was just no more money in R&D for aerospace, and so these people were it's also a kind of desperately trying to find a place for this technology. And the problem of the city, which was seen as the largest problem of American society at the time, was seen as really nothing more than a kind of market to attempt to shift to, because the market was drying up after the moonshot. There was no anyone who ever thought the space race was a kind of continuous thing and not a short-term project to produce that one television image was kind of missing out on what the real story was.
I was thinking as Nicholas was talking about it, to me that was very poignant. This story about the astronauts sort of unplugging from the monitors. I think that's and I realized maybe I guess I'm trying to use these stories to figure out what underlying condition are these projects a symptom of? I mean, to do a kind of theory of symptomology, right? And maybe it's not a desire for totality. Maybe it's actually a renewed uncertainty about our place as individuals and as individual bodies in a world that has now, with Apollo, which one was it that got the picture?
It was the last one, actually.
Yeah. But this kind of vastly expanded. Expanding and expanded understanding of the universe. And I'm thinking, like in the 17th century, with the discovery of infinity, with that all of a sudden, the kind of certainty of a center that is occupied either by the king or by the pope, and that center is coterminous with the earth and the cosmos, right? That those discoveries were completely disrupted, and you think of the Baroque itself as a kind of response to that disruption, right, and that uncertainty. And maybe part of what we're seeing is attempts in some ways collectively to figure this renewed uncertainty of individuals in this larger space in that sense. And I think I was thinking of films, late 60s, early 70s science fiction films. Antoine, and I were whispering about Soylent Green. Do you remember? Where, if you don't know this, it's this anxiety about feedback loops and about closed. It's an anxiety about closed systems where the food now, the primary food for humans is this little green pellet that turns out is of course made from
People.
corpses, from people,
It's
yeah,
people.
and or body snatchers and the status of the uncertainty of the individual body in a larger system, and it really came home to me in this photograph of the drawing of the faucets where you couldn't tell if the faucet was flowing out or flowing in, and the kind of anxiety about a totally closed system. So anyway, something like that seems very right. I want to open it just briefly to comments and questions from the audience. Antoine.
Struck me in these three stories was the folly by the end. Everyone gets crazy in your stories. So I was wondering, and the classical interpretation is, of course, the closed world of Edwards or Sloterdijk and the giant interior. But I think perhaps more interesting for me by the end, because we're getting accustomed to these ideas, is that we got mad inside those confines. So is it a new form of, interior phantasmagoria? What's going on? Why did we get mad? the question by the end, because I remember atmosphere used to be in Vitruvius. You have the wind that in some way pacifies and makes people precisely not be crazy. But there, by the end, the atmosphere is what makes you crazy. So.
I mean, I think that there was there are several I'm still wearing the pragmatist hat, so I'm gonna, I think that there's several, I think, really simple architectural and cultural explanations for that. One, the resemblance between the interior and the movie theater, and the way in which the larger way in which the line between science fiction and people got really excited by the way in which the lines between science fiction and science fact were seeming to collapse, and therefore a kind of realm, an imagination of what was possible, and the social and literal connections between NASA and, say, Kubrick's staff are, the assistant, Werner von Braun's longtime assistant, Frederick Ordway, became Kubrick's assistant on 2001. There was no functional or social separation between the kind of fictional reality. That guy, Peter Hyams, who is the CBS producer of the Lunar broadcast, wrote my favorite 1970s film, Capricorn 1, about this kind of fake Mars landing in which they have to escape from the closed system in order to, and Telly Savalas in a biplane comes and, rescues them, and it's the kind of this amazing thing. But I think that that blurring and these people, I mean, I have there's this company, Applied Minds, which now produces most of the kind of is currently building the U.S. Cyber Command, which is like a super mission control space to control all of cyberspace. And they, I went and interviewed the director, and he said to me, well, how we still get most of our business is that one of these, Joint Chiefs of Staff goes and sees an X-Men movie and sees something like the display that's three-dimensional, and they say, well, why don't I have that? And I mean, literally, it was just that matter of fact. And so I think this blurring between the kind of the sort of vast infrastructure of this military-industrial century allowed us to both artfully and beautifully blur. I mean, the kind of performance piece of Apollo was just astonishing, one of the great kind of spectacles of the 20th century. But then also the kind of, not even dark side, but the sort of the ways in which the science fiction and reality don't actually fit together also become deeply interesting.
I'll answer first to the question of interior phantasmagoria and people going crazy in our presentations. And I'll bring up, as a kind of rational explanation to the craziness, Freud's battle with Sandor Ferenczi and the symptoms of hysteria. Where in early 20th century they had a very similar debate about inner and outer worlds and about how hysteria occurs, and Sandor Frenzy developed these terms for his theory of hysterical materialization, which was the autoplastic and the alloplastic, where the alloplastic was a kind of body which was in consonance with an exterior environment other than its interior physiology and psychology, and the autoplastic was an interior organization. And obviously, hysteria was allied with the autoplastic processes of adaptation, which was processes that internalized and the sealing of that body. So this psychoanalysis theory was directly adapted from Maturana and Varela in the second cybernetics order in their coining of the autopoietic systems. And this is very much relevant contextually with what we were discussing about, because they defined autopoietic systems as kind of very different systems that, because the kind of output they generate, and they prove that biologically, I cannot fully explain the processes that they documented, why that happens, but it was apparently also a model that could be documented in physical substances. That was when a model was using its own output as input, it was changing its internal organization itself and producing kind of unpredictable behaviors, which was very different from all the kind of missile industry and von Neumann kind of discussing missile trajectory and cybernetics and Wiener mathematics and all of these people that developed the kind of discipline of cybernetics to apply to exterior environments. So in a way, I don't know. I mean, there's obviously not a way to respond about why people get crazy in interior closed sealed environments, but there's a very strong legacy that migrates different epistemological and philosophical and technological fields that addresses this issue. So I don't see this specific kind of context of the post-war period as a kind of isolated historical incident where the issue of utopia was readdressed through the context of the Earth, but as a kind of continuation of earlier debates that found kind of fertile ground to be addressed through the kind of convergence of issues of technology merging with issues of environmental perception. And to respond to the earlier question about the astronaut, I think there's something also very interesting to be said about the kind of extreme of scales in that period, that the first kind of vision that addressed the city as a whole from the post-war period was College City, and in between there was a lack of kind of urban interventions that were not these utopian projects like Yona Friedman and all these kind of detached visions of reality, Archigram and so forth. And there was the extremity of scales, like the figure of the human body with the astronaut suit and in relation to a vast space, which was reflected on outer space, was a type of symptom of the time. I don't know. I don't exactly know where I'm going with that, but I'm thinking of a kind of crisis of non-addressing urbanity and urbanization, other than through systems management transferred as systems to understand the city. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And lastly, I just want to briefly mention that there were all these images when I was doing archival research of reproducing the kind of landing of the moon in Long Island, which was crazy, and kind of making the craters of the moon, and there was always an interest of the juxtaposition of the human figure as a kind of symbol of habitation to the vast land without any other space.
Yeah. I think it'd be interesting to try to think through and reconstruct on the one hand, this intense return or intense construction of environmentalism, and thinking that we have to now understand ourselves as part of nature, and yet urbanism in the city doesn't fit comfortably into that yet. I mean, we don't have the same optimism about cities in the 1960s and 70s, late 60s, early 70s, as we do now. And and I think there's something also about this enclosure of a self-sustaining environment that's very anti-urban in a way, and it's also based on a kind of fear of the city ground as being toxic, and the city environment and the city air, the atmosphere as being the kind of toxic miasma, as opposed to the life-giving atmosphere.
Yeah.
So,
When you have a question?
Michael, yeah.
Aha. Okay, so on the subject of madness and these interior environments, so this is a little bit of point about sort of if David and Nicholas were to compare notes, the point of convergence where I think you could do it is the notion of what was called the task environment, which comes from the Rand Corporation. So these task environments were defined in the 50s and 60s at Rand out of a series of studies that they did essentially of control room environments and other sorts of decision-making spaces. And the point there is that they were intended, they weren't intended to sort of regulate things in a smooth way, but actually to increase and maintain a consistent level of tension. It was very much like the end on board in the factory, sort of in the same period, that all of these studies were of how many terminals you had, how densely they were packed, how quickly you would swap out different technicians so that everybody would be always on edge, always on a state of alert in a kind of sustained way so that there would never be stasis. Everything would be flowing essentially. And so there was a sort of heavy amount of studying of environment in a very specific capacity for this decision-making sort of way. And I think that there's a certain nice relationship between the papers in that sense. But, and here's the sort of caveat, in order to look at those kinds of things and see how it folds back onto some of this work, I think one has to distinguish a little bit between the cultures of different sorts of institutions. And that was a sense I got in some of the material in Nicholas's talk, for example, is that there was a kind of too easy gliding back and forth between the culture of the Air Force or of the Defense Department and that of NASA as very different institutions. They had very different politics, very different cultures. And I think without that kind of specificity, there can be a risk of a sort of technological determinism that kind of creeps very frequently into some of this material, where it ends up falling back into what I think has been some of the discussion about technologies that emerge from the military-industrial complex, then kind of seeping out into other things, and then counterculture reactions to them, etc., which I think David has usefully pointed out, that all of that discussion, or most of it, can be subsumed pretty easily into a kind of classic Marxist framework. So that's a comment rather than a question.
Do we?
Yeah,
Is it time for us?
Maybe this will be the
First of all, I'm going to respond to your question in a second. I'm totally obsessed now with Nicholas and concept of the intergalactic Bartleby, who, like Mario Tronti, pulls the anal thermometer out of his rear end as an act of protest. I just, you need to join the autonomy movement in Italy. All right. What was I going to say? Oh, well, it's interesting. Beatrice Colomina wrote a very good piece about control rooms. I think it was in Grey Room about 6 or 7 years ago, and she dates them to she looks at these men, right, that are at these monitors, and she traces it back to sometime around World War II. I would argue that what she's describing can actually be traced earlier to European and American stock trading rooms. That those spaces, that control rooms emerge from the heart of capital, and that I'm totally interested in that cultural transference. I think we tend to think like military, and so we look at along these lines through war to see where these technologies originate when they're moving around or being appropriated in very interesting ways, and not that it's structural, but that there are companies like Philco, et cetera, that outfit these places that say, I have this expertise and it can work in a stock room or it can work in Florida. So those are very interesting, or it can work for countercultural movement in London. So yeah, I think those kinds of questions are very key. And I am interested in the historical questions. I am interested in the origins of those rooms. I don't think that they're aerospace, personally. Of course, it's not a personal mission of mine to trace that, but my instinct is, from what I've seen, that they're much older.
The first sort of control space was a room just for the Joint Chiefs of Staff with sliding panels with showing different kinds of information that was adapted from a corporate model that was very precisely, but instead of the competitors' figures were the Soviet ground troop figures versus so I think there was that total. But I don't think unfortunately, I think it's impossible to underestimate the kind of complicity between what we see as NASA, what we see as corporate reality, what we see as, I think because it was, and what even, I mean, Eisenhower wanted to call it the military-industrial academic complex, but his speechwriter said it was too long. But the... Yeah, no, and so I was actually attempting to make that distinction. I think it's much more, it's too enmeshed to be even rational, and therefore I think that's a really important point. I also wanted to relate. I think Antoine has talked about this too, but the design of the very first control environment of the Sage rooms and consoles. Some of the most interesting literature I came across was trying to make the operator totally symbiotic with the console very explicitly, and on edge, and the consequence of that in the design of the Sage console. If you look closely, right in the middle, where the light gun and Soviet pixels are moving across the screen, is a giant electric cigarette lighter and ashtray that was designed to keep the operator, constantly, so they wouldn't have to leave the console, but could be constantly, stimulated, and this kind of notion of breathing in this stimulating, nicotine-laced fumes, I think is really, interesting as
there's much more to be said, I'm sure, and I hope maybe we can merge the remaining comments and questions into some of the other discussions later. But in fairness of the others, we'll close now. Peter.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. That was great. Thank you. It was very good. Really enjoyed that.